on the time. Our next speaker is Dr. Niklas Hopfgartner, who's a data scientist at Neccton. Niklas replaces Dr. Michael Auer, who unfortunately was unable to join us here today. Niklas is here to tell us about behavioral risk factors and suitable interventions. Niklas, over to you. Please come to the stage. Welcome. Thank you. Can you stay?
Yeah, welcome everybody also from my side. And yeah, probably most of you have realized that I'm not Mike Lauer, but I promise you that I will do my best to replace him. And also thanks to my previous speaker for providing this great segue for my presentation, because I'm going to talk a little bit about the academic research, what we are doing in order to identify behavioral risk factors and interventions for problem gambling, which provides the basis and the foundations for all these type of responsible gambling solutions out there. So some background about myself. So I have a PhD in computer science. My topic was all about risk factors and interventions for problem gambling. Throughout my PhD, I've published more than 10 peer-reviewed papers on responsible gambling. And I'm also doing consulting on gambling-related topics. And as Willem already mentioned, I'm the data science lead at Neccton, which also has developed a player tracking tool and a responsible gambling tool called Mentor. And Mentor is now used by also, I think, 20 gambling operators in Germany and also 4 lottery providers in Germany. So regarding problem gambling, we have 2 major problems to solve. So first of all, we need to find a way to early identify potential problematic gambling behavior. And one way how this is usually addressed is through self-tests. And such a self-test usually uses standardized screens like the BGSI, which is the Problem Gambling Severity Index. There, gamblers are asked questions whether their gambling caused financial problems on their household, or whether they need to gamble with increased amounts of money in order to get the same level of excitement and so on. However, these type of screens or questionnaires have one big disadvantage. Namely, obviously, gamblers need to answer these questions in the first place. And therefore, the answers to those questions are not available on a large scale and not in real time. And once we know whether a person has some problems with their gambling, we need to design and provide effective interventions to curb such behavior. Usually, or one way how this is tackled is through responsible gambling tools. I'm sure most of you know them, like limits, play breaks, or self-exclusions, or providing feedback like messages. And another way how this is approached is through regulations. So as Germany has recently introduced the global deposit limit of 1,000 euros per month. However, also these type of interventions has some limitations. So first of all, if we look at the responsible gambling tools, these are often based on common sense and developed out of a gut feeling. And they are not always baked with a lot of research behind of it. And if we look at the regulations, we shouldn't judge people by the money they have or by the money they don't have. And what I mean by that is, if I would lose 1,000 euro each month, this would be quite a big deal for me. And I also think that this is true for most of the other problem gamblers out there, so that they don't have so much money available and therefore never hit this type of limit. On the other hand, I think there are also a few players out there who have a lot of disposable income available, and therefore for these type of players, this limit is obviously too low. And yeah, this was already mentioned a lot of times today. So in order to address these 2 main big problems, we do a lot of academic research and publish a lot of papers, because we think it is important that we publicly share our results and share it with other researchers, and therefore we can discuss all together and work together to improve player protection and player safety. So here my colleague Michael Auer, together with Mark Griffiths, created a study or wrote a paper where they used AI algorithms to predict self-reported problem gambling using player tracking data. So what we did here, we had access to about 1,300 gamblers from an European online casino, and all those gamblers answered the questions of the problem gambling severity index, so we know whether they were self-reported problem gamblers or not. And here you can see some statistics of these players. So we grouped them into 3 categories, namely PG, problem gamblers, greater harm problem gamblers, and non-problem gamblers, based on their answers to the PGSI. What we found here was quite interestingly, that problem gamblers' total deposits or total spendings were lower compared to non-problem gamblers, which is kind of counterintuitive, right? However, we found that problem gamblers deposit more frequently within a single gambling session as compared to non-problem gamblers. And this might be an indication that those type of people are chasing their losses because they are constantly loading up their gambling wallet within a single gambling session. Similar, we found that problem gamblers more frequently depleted their accounts, which means that they only stopped gambling when they had no more money left in their gambling accounts, which means they completely re-gamble all their winnings. And lastly, we also found that problem gamblers more often self-excluded as compared to non-problem gamblers. So this was the first study. Then we tried to validate these findings a little bit using in a second study. Here we tried to predict whether a person will self-exclude in the future, given the player tracking data. And here we analyzed about 26,000 online gamblers across 6 different countries and from 3 different gambling operators. And what we found here was, so on the y-axis you see the different countries, and what we found here was that the more different payment methods the gamblers used, the more likely they were to self-exclude in the future. And this might be an indication that those gamblers might suffer from financial problems, which is also correlated and associated with problem gambling in literature. Next, we also found that if gamblers frequently changed their limits and also used self-exclusions in the past, these were also associated with gamblers taking a self-exclusion in the near future. And this might be a sign that those type of gamblers might have some unsuccessful attempts to stop or to control their gambling. Because if you frequently change your limits or self-exclude and then come back and start gambling again, you might had an unsuccessful attempt to stop or control it. And we also found the same behavior in the previous study where we used self-reported problem gambling. There we also found that problem gamblers more frequently self-excluded. And last, we also found that the more frequent gamblers deposited within a single gambling session, the more likely they were to self-exclude in the future. And this might be an indication that those type of people are chasing their losses, as already said, because they are constantly loading up their gambling account within a single gambling session and therefore chase their losses. And we also found the same result in the previous study where we used self-reported problem gambling. So we see here a pretty strong overlap in the results here and used 2 different measures, so to say. The next question which we asked ourselves was whether we actually need monetary features like the amount bet or the amount deposit or the amount lost in order to identify problematic gambling. And in the self-exclusion study here, we found that in 5 out of the 6 countries which we analyzed, none of the monetary features improved the prediction of our models. So we didn't need this information at all in order to predict whether a person will self-exclude in the future. And in the first study, we found that problem gamblers' total spendings were lower compared to the non-problem gamblers. And therefore, we suggest that monetary features like the amount bet or the amount deposit are probably not needed or not ideal to identify problem gambling. Then we switch gears a little bit, so we now know a little bit what behavioral factors are associated with problem gambling. Now we look what type of interventions are effective. And here we did a study about the effects of mandatory play breaks. So here we analyzed about 23,000 online gamblers at Norsk Tipping, which is the Norwegian gambling operator. And at Norsk Tipping, when you gamble continuously for 1 hour, you receive such a mandatory play break. And here, this is the pop-up window, which informs the player that they now cannot gamble for the next 90 seconds. And now we wanted to know whether a play break of 90 seconds is long enough or whether we should increase the duration. And we also wanted to make sure that if we increase the duration that players do not churn, because if players churn and switch to other providers, then this is not a good thing, obviously. And also we wanted to evaluate whether when we increase the break duration, whether gamblers increase their stakes afterwards due to increased cravings. Therefore, we made a randomized experiment where we randomly assigned gamblers to a different play break duration. So we had one control group, which got the default 90 seconds play break. Then we had another group which had a 5-minute play break, and another group which had a 15-minute play break. And we then looked how many gamblers stopped gambling after they had received the play break for that day. And in the control group, those were the gamblers who received the 90 seconds break. Only 1% of them stopped gambling for that day after they have received the mandatory play break. And if we look at the 5-minute condition, so here the gamblers received the 5-minute break, here 3% of them stopped gambling for that day after they have received the mandatory break. And in the last case, here the gamblers received a 15-minute play break, and here almost 6% of them stopped gambling for that day after they had received the break. So we found that we had a 4 times increase in gamblers who stopped playing when they receive a 15-minute break compared to the 90 seconds one. We also found that gamblers did not churn the longer the breaks lasted. And we also found that gamblers did not increase their stakes with longer mandatory breaks. And therefore, in this case, we recommend that mandatory breaks should be at least 15 minutes long to have a positive effect here. Then we looked into the efficacy of voluntary self-exclusions. So here we did a study where we had access to about 3,000 gamblers who opted for a self-exclusion in a British online casino. And we then grouped these gamblers into 2 groups. So we had roughly 2,000 short-term self-excluders, so those self-excluded for 38 days or less. And out of these, 75% started gambling again once the self-exclusion was over. And if we look at the other group, here we had about 1,400 long-term self-excluders, those self-excluded for half a year or more. And out of these, only 1% started to gamble again. And then we also looked whether those gamblers who started to gamble again changed their behavior after they start gambling again. And what we found was that gamblers did not change their behavior compared to a matched control group when they started gambling again. Therefore, we conclude that it is really important to monitor self-excluders who start to gamble again, especially if they self-exclude due to problem gambling. Next, as already said, mandatory breaks should be at least 15 minutes long. We also identified several behavioral factors which were associated with self-reported problem gambling and also with voluntary self-exclusion, namely usage of multiple payment methods, increased responsible gambling behavior like frequently changing limits or using self-exclusions and then start gambling again, and also frequent in-session deposits, which is a sign of chasing losses. And lastly, we also found that monetary features were not associated with gamblers taking a self-exclusion, and also we found that problem gamblers deposited less in total compared to non-problem gamblers. And therefore, I want to share an idea or an hypothesis with you. So I think it's better if we move our focus a little bit away from monetary factors, moreover, and instead look into behavioral factors. And my hypothesis or my idea would be, which I would like to share with you and discuss with you, maybe it would be better if we let the gamblers choose to either limit the number of deposits which they can make per month, to let's say that they can only deposit once per week, or they can choose the to limit the amount of money which they can deposit, as for example in Germany, the 1,000 euro deposit limit. Because I think if gamblers choose to limit the number of deposits per month, this may reduce the usage of different payment methods, because we just simply limit the frequency. And if I today make a deposit with my bank account, I cannot deposit afterwards with my credit card if I run out of money, because it's limited, right? Then this might also reduce the number of limit changes, because the whole idea of a limit is that you need to pre-commit of how much money you are willing to spend, right? And if I have a limit on the number of deposits which I can make, I also need to pre-commit of how much money I'm willing to spend throughout the next week or the month. So this is kind of the same here. And finally, this would or could also had a very strong reduction on frequent in-session deposits, since I simply cannot deposit more often, and therefore I cannot chase my losses in a single gambling session. However, I would like to put a big caution and disclaimer out here. So this is just a hypothesis of me. So we need a lot of further research and discussion before we would introduce such a measure, like asking gamblers about the attitude about such a limit. We should analyze how many gamblers would be affected of such a limit. And we should always introduce such a measure voluntary first, and then evaluate how effective it is before making it mandatory, for example. That said, I hope you learned a little bit from my presentation. Thanks.